Welcome everybody to what should prove to be a really interesting conversation. I think last I checked, we had something like 230 participants signed up for this session, so it should be a good one. So if you're new and joining us for the first time, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are streaming this live to YouTube right now and recording the conversation. And the way that it'll work is it's mainly going to be a fireside chat following just a short introduction from me. We've got some amazing panelists and speakers here with us today who I'll introduce you to shortly. So the fireside chat will take about an hour. And then for those of you who are interested and available, we'll go into a question and answer period that should be about 10 or 15 minutes. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our speakers, please feel free to share either in chat if you're joining us on Zoom or in the sidebar if you're joining us via YouTube. So getting right into the topic, leverage points. Donella Meadows initially introduced them in 1997 as places where we can intervene in a complex system and where a small shift in one thing can produce changes in everything. So for those of us committed to or interested in systems change, intervention points are alluring. With limited energy and resources, we can have an outsized impact. So as a concept, leverage points are really useful because they provide us with a lens through which we can not only make sense of immensely complex systems, but also consider where our efforts may be best allocated. And at the same time, like many things in life, and especially system change work, the work of identifying and influencing leverage points is much easier said than done. So fortunately, we have, as I've mentioned, 4 exceptional speakers with us today who each bring their own unique perspective as it relates to leverage points. First is Anna Birney, who is the director of the School of Systems Change, the global director of Systems Change and Learning Community at the Forum for the Future. And Anna is also the author of Cultivating System Change, a Practitioner's Companion, and a recent report, which actually sparked a conversation between Anna and Joss that led to the conversation that you're all joining us with. And that paper is How Do We Know Where There is Potential to Intervene and Leverage Impact in a Changing System? The Practitioner's Perspective. At the heart of Anna's work with Forum for the Future and the School of System Change is Anna's passion about designing and facilitating programs for individuals, organizations, and systems to learn and find innovative approaches to change. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you, Mark.
And next, we have Orit Gal, who is a senior lecturer for strategy and complexity at Regent's University, London. Orit specializes in the practical applications of complexity theories and, as an expert generalist, has worked in tech startups, corporate market research, peace-building NGOs, and innovative policy and military think tanks. Through her work with decision makers working in messy and volatile contexts, Orit has set out on a path to search for knowledge that could help design more effective action. Through the creation of social acupuncture, which is one of the models we'll look at today, she's bringing this research to light. Welcome, Orit.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone.
And next we have Alex Penn, who is a complexity scientist and a senior research fellow at the University of Surrey, and a principal member of the new CCAN, which is the Center for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus, which is a collaboration between academics, policy professionals, and the UK government focused on generating novel, cutting-edge methods for evaluating policy for complex systems. Alex is a true interdisciplinarian who's worked across a broad array of disciplines and with a broad array of stakeholders. She's also the creator of Systems Aikido. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Mark, and hi, everyone.
And finally, we have Danielle PoppyThornton, who has a rich background that spans everything from 6 years in Cambodia as the founder of a youth leadership organization to designing and teaching leadership programs at the University of Oxford, being a lecturer at the Yale School of Management, and serving as the deputy director for the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship. Danielle is also the creator of the Impact Gaps Canvas, the author of the widely read report, Tackling Heropreneurship, and the founder of Systems-Led Leadership, where she works to catalyze and design education and funding programs to cultivate system-led leaders, individuals who start from a place of understanding the systems within which they work. Welcome, Daniela.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So with that, my role as host is really just to step out of the way of these incredible speakers. So let me hand it off to them with the opening question of just, in a few sentences, how would each of you describe your relationship with this topic of leverage points and new ways to approach leverage points? And maybe we'll start with you, Anna. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah. So it's always a bit nerve-wracking going first. And also, you know, I love it. I'm loving the words people are using like Aikido and acupuncture. And I guess we were also using the word potential. But I think this question, when we work with practitioners at the School of Systems Change, and many of you probably on this call, you know, we keep asking, where do we intervene? Like, we're doing all this analysis and we're kind of understanding it, but how do we know? Like, how do we know? Am I doing the right thing? Am I actually going to change the system? So there's a real practical questions people come to you with when you run these programs, and they're not interested in the analysis, kind of getting deep here, but they want ways to help them understand where to intervene. And so I think Meadows provided a very good starting point. Great work on
No. So let's maybe give Anna a second. Okay. So hopefully she rejoins us. Maybe let's pause and Orit, would you like to pick up the question for now, and then hopefully Anna joins us back? So again, what brings you to the topic of leverage points or new approaches to leverage points?
Sure. I think it comes from the fact that, you know, so many of the challenges that we deal with today involve so many people and so many, you know, wider factors that are interconnected and interdependent. So whether, you know, you're operating as a startup or whether you're operating in terms of sustainability or you know, conflict resolution, anything that you really need to deal with is systemic. So it comes from there in terms of where can you intervene with small interventions, because obviously you can't control the system. So how do you design small actions that will have wider effects? And in that sense, it sounds really, really big, but when you understand that you're really a player that is operating within a wider network, and when you understand that at the essence, this network is really all about people, organizations interacting and exchanging flows of resources, information, and behaviors, then at its essence, when you understand those flows, it's really about two things. How do you design actions that will either disrupt or strengthen specific patterns that for you make sense within that system? And I think, and again, I'm sure we're going to unpack a lot of this, but for me, the most important thing to highlight is that it all starts with who you are in that system. You know, nobody operates above the system or really at the systemic level. We all operate within the system. So it all starts with understanding where you are within that and then thinking creatively, collaborative, subvertively of how you can start to impact change. And a lot more to say, but I think it's going to come up in the conversation.
That's perfect. Thanks so much, Orit. And welcome back, Anna. So maybe back
Sorry
to you.
about that.
Not a problem.
edge, and I think it's fine, but it's hit its edge. So apologies for that. Living in the remote world and actually just about to go on holiday, so doing it from a caravan park, if I'm totally honest with you all. But I guess, sorry about that, but I think the thing I was going to say was the framing of leverage is around how do we make it part of dynamic systems? How do we look at it from a relational perspective? How do we look at it as changing? And how do we work with the potential of systems change from that perspective? So looking at it not from the kind of thinking of it as silver bullets or knowing exactly where to do it, but actually working with relational dynamics. So that was just my framing. And I think we can continue the conversation as we go along, and hopefully I won't duck out again.
Perfect. Thank you, Anna. And maybe next to Daniela, I think, or your comment about people in the system and really situating and understanding where they are in the system reminds me of some of what I've encountered from your work, Daniela, around heropreneurship and people in the system. But don't let me frame. How did you come to this conversation?
Sure. So I'm often in a business school setting, an accelerator program setting, or working with social entrepreneurs, social innovators, right? So I'm usually working with people who are prone to action, right? They like have this idea and they're taught this lean startup methodology, throw things against the wall, fail fast. And it's all about how fast can I get something to market? How fast can I take action, right? And so I'm in that world, I'm often trying to like pull the reins back a bit and say, like, let's look at the system. Before we dive into the solution. So I just wanted to put that caveat out there to say that there are sometimes people who all like work with a PhD student and they are so deep in the system and so deep in the problem that I just like go to a hackathon, right? So we have to kind of have this balance, but I just wanted to frame that my perspective comes from that world that is very action oriented. And teaching social entrepreneurship, social innovation, I was realizing that we were fueling this action before understanding, and that the idea of looking at what I call impact gaps, but impact gaps are possibilities for leverage, right? So they're leverage points. So that is such a useful tool to just, it's hard, but to tell people to hang up your idea for a minute, and step back. And, it would be common sense that if we were really cared about an issue, we would first say, what's happening? What are the numbers? What's going on with this problem? What's holding it in place? Who benefits from it staying a problem, right? Whatever, what's that system look like? What's it connected to? What are the relationships? All that. And then to say, who's already trying to solve this? What's already being tried? Like, what's already working? What's going on? What's not working? And then you have impact gaps. So like spaces between the problem, the system, the issues going on, what you think, and what's already being tried, right? And there are opportunities for leverage for change. And so the work that I do often says, like, I want you to come up with as many possible leverage points that you can identify beyond your own idea. And what I think that helps people do is sometimes they end up throwing out their idea because they realize there's leverage points that they'd be better suited to contribute to. Or sometimes they can stick with their idea, but they then see a way that they can contribute beyond the bounds of their organization or themselves. And then I would say it fits with what Orit just said, with you, that should be as objective as possible. Can never be objective. We all have our own glasses. We have our own life, experience. So we're always looking at a system through our own lens, but as objective as possible. Then you get to be subjective. Who am I in relation to this? What do I care about? What am I good at? What am I interested in learning? What connections do I have? So that's kind of the arc of how I look at that piece of impact gaps / leverage points.
Great. Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you.
And this theme of really listening to the system before acting really reminds me of Alex, your work, and systems Aikido. So on to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I was thinking exactly the same. Firstly, to say I can't take credit for firstly coining the Aikido concept. I've taken this really from permaculture design. So Bill Mollison talked about doing Aikido on the landscape, and similarly to what Daniela just talked about there, one of the sort of core principles in a permaculture design process is that you have this idea of protracted and thoughtful observation rather than protracted and thoughtless labor. So we try to move, towards really spending the time to understanding the system, to understanding what the dynamics are, and what are the structures that are sustaining those dynamics, so that we can make these thoughtful interventions that work with the system's own dynamics. And really the idea of systems Aikido there is to create win-win situations, if you like, between yourself and the system. But I think another really important component of the Aikido approach, as I see it, and that I try to instantiate. I mean, when I talk to policymakers, I'm not quite talking in these terms, but it's to enter into interaction with the system. I mean, so there is this idea of, one wants to gather information, if you like, and make objective models. But for many problems, I would say most sort of social complex systems problems, we can't really do that. We can't have complete knowledge of the system. Things are changing all the time. And we have to essentially do what Andrew Pickering called this staging dances of agency, where we learn systems by thoughtfully interacting with them, waiting for them to respond, and then carrying on a process of interaction. So our knowledge, of course, comes into that, and our modeling and all the sorts of work we do, but we're really always learning by doing and in interaction with the system. So it's a quite an embedded approach. I mean, the way I apply that, I've applied it in sort of bacterial biofilms and in working in policy and DEFRA and these sorts of things, and it's obviously different in every context, but that philosophy is really underpinning it all. Yeah, and I guess the leverage point is it's the thoughtful intervention, isn't it? It's using the system's own momentum. Where can what is the system's momentum? What is its potential? How can you work with the system to redirect that? So it sounds, very esoteric, but my work is to translate that into practical action in different contexts.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'm tempted to take us in a direction, and this is going to be a really meaty question, but hopefully sort of it frames the rest of the conversation. So we've talked a lot about the importance of pausing to really understand the system, or Alex, as you just described, to continually interact with a system as we're understanding it. I'm curious, how do you think about what characteristics complex systems have, or how do you make sense of the systems that we're interacting with? So this idea of, leverage points and thinking about how we might intervene to influence something starts from the place of saying we have to have a sense of what it is that we're even working with. So I'm curious, how do you describe either the characteristics of complex systems or these things that we're interacting with? And maybe Alex, start with you and go back through the order.
Sure. So, well, I guess in the work that I do, my day job in government and with different stakeholders elsewhere, we do participatory modelling. So we do a lot of systems modelling, coming up together with collectives of people who might be policymakers or who are stakeholders on the ground in a situation, bringing people together to represent their knowledge of a system's causal structure and what's important in the system by building sort of simple participatory systems maps. And that's, we sometimes we'll go on to sort of more complex methods like agent-based modeling or this kind of thing. We'll also use a lot of sort of qualitative approaches. But really, essentially, the underpinning thing is to map the system, bringing diverse knowledge together to get an idea of what the system is. And we do a lot of different things to work out and to agree how we're going to bound the system, what is the focus of the system, to try to kind of get something that represents everyone's perspectives. But really, we're sort of starting off with some things that are mental models there. We will often have we'll often go away and bring in empirical data to test those things, or there'll be framings for other models. But really, that's the core starting point for us: is can we come up with a causal systems model of the system together with people? So that is one method of developing understanding, and it gives us a framework to identify where our knowledge gaps are, to ask questions, to see who else is involved. But that would be the starting point. So what is within the system? What are the interrelationships between those two things? And then we can often explicitly ask too, what are the sort of norms and assumptions around that system? If I'm working in a biological context, I'll be using really sort of more experimental microbiology techniques. But I mean, it's quite a different situation, obviously, in a participatory modeling than in the lab, or in the wild. But I think, also experiential knowledge in some of these systems, capturing experiential knowledge, even if you're looking at biology, this is, how people interact, what you can gather from people. That's always important.
Great, thank you. Daniela.
Similar thoughts. I use mapping tools often, but I would view it as like, how do we get people to zoom out and surface assumptions, like Alex just said. And I love the Aikido framing. Alex, I don't know if you've come across Richard Strozzi's work, but he does Aikido work for like personal leadership development. And I found so many similarities in how he's teaching this personal leadership development model with how we look at systems. And obviously we are part of, as already pointed out, we're always in the system, right? And so I think there's, one of the examples that he uses that I think is helpful in this thinking is, there's a woman who comes to a coach and says, I'm really having trouble getting my points across at work, and I'm really, I want to do some presentation training and public speaking training, and I think just my stuff's not landing, and it's not, and so we could just go down that path and, find her the best coaches and the world's best trainers and all these things, right? But if we don't zoom out and start asking questions and figure out what our assumptions are and look at like the system a bit, you might not realize she's the only female on a board of 8 men, right? And she's 20 years younger than everyone, right? And so it doesn't matter. We can do all that training, but actually if we can make slight tweaks, maybe to that system of, where that she's in, that might be a bigger leverage point to the ability for her words to land than the world's best training, right? And so I think there's like, I love that analogy, and it often helps people to think about their own interactions in a system. And sometimes it's like unknown unknowns, right? Things that we just need to surface. And sometimes it's really a matter of like mapping stuff out, and it's an aha moment of we're focusing on something that isn't deep enough to make really profound change.
Thank you. So I hear sort of this idea of really drawing on diverse perspectives and engaging a lot of actors to collectively make sense of the system. And Daniela, the image I got as you were describing that was almost like a zooming out and starting with one system, but then really zooming out to see what are the other systems that might be contributing to the system that we're interested in. Orit, curious what your thoughts are.
Sure. I guess for me, it really depends what is the context of the inquiry. Is this about entrepreneurship, or is this about system change? Because that takes you down very different paths. So for example, if we are talking about system change, it will usually start with, people coming together because something really pisses them off, right? Something is broken in the system. It's really annoying. It's really frustrating. And then the question is, okay, so what is this thing? And we tend to focus on the overall structure of the overall problem and say, this is what it is and this is what we want to change. And we tend to think about it as a structure, but the structure sounds as something that is fixed. But when you understand complexity, you actually understand that it's not fixed. It is not something that is there. It is actually something that is being recreated every day by all the behaviors of everyone that are part of that network that is underlying that system. So therefore, for me, I always start with two questions. First of all, what is changing? Because from the bottom up, incentives, behaviors, technologies, culture, whatever it is, something is moving this. So the first thing you need to start to map out is actually what is changing in the system. And it's not in the wider system, but it is within the people and the network that operate in it. So I look for technological change, political, economic, and cultural change, and start to identify that. And the other thing I very much focus on is tensions. So once you understand where shifts are beginning to happen, so where are the contradictions? Where do you see shifts that are converging? And then you can think about how you can use that as potential. Or where do you see shifts that are actually contradicting? And what you actually have in the system are these unsustainable tensions that are building up. And this is another great source of leverage point and strategic potential.
Thank you, Arvid. So yeah, in terms of back to the original question of how do we even think about these complex systems that we're trying to work with, I completely love your comment that it really depends on the context and the system that we're working with, because it changes quite dramatically how we would understand it. But
yeah, sorry, Mark.
Yeah,
I was going to say it does, and yet I liked your question about what are the characteristics of a complex system, and how do you start. What are the questions? I like those questions that you totally agree with those questions, and then there's also something around, one characteristic of systems is they're nested or they're fractal. So they're repeating patterns at different levels. So it's about trying to understand, we talk about zooming in and zooming out. So how do we start understanding not just, I need to do this thing over here, or maybe an entrepreneur, but actually how does that affect the bigger system? Or maybe you have a massive problem about changing the whole economic system, but you need to kind of work out, well, which bit are you in and how do you affect that? So there's something about those nested layers and the patterns that are repeating across different layers. There's something about the system as relational, and I think that does relate to the quality of the system of, yes, it's the structures, but when we look at the structures, we don't often look at the flows and the relational and the movement. So I think that just speaks to what Orit was saying around how things are changing in the system, not just the structure of it, but and that is a lot to do with the power, which does also relate to tensions, like where is the current power, where is power moving? And I don't just mean power over, I mean like flows of energy and how those are working in the system. And that really gives us a lot of indication of how energy is moving through the system, be it finance or information or people, depending on what system you're looking at. You can start seeing, okay, how do I change that flow? How do I move with that? But also a characteristic of the system. A system is not just the structure and flows, it's also what is the collective outcome of that? What is the collective system, its goal, we could say, or its function or its purpose? And how do we understand that? Like, is the goal of the economic system just perpetuating growth rather than actually how is it creating a healthy people and planet? I mean, these are big terms, but for your subsystems, you can maybe find more dynamism in that. So how might we understand that? And we have to remember that when we're talking about this work, we're also talking about people. We're talking about humans and our relationship with our planet and each other and our social beings. And I bring in the concept of consciousness and saying we have the ability to reflect. We have the self-reflective ability as humans. And so an element you need to bring into the system, yes, Daniela talked about objectiveness, but you need to bring in the subjective and our worldviews. And this is why mental models, worldviews, and paradigms are really important, because we are co-creating the system. The way we think about the world is also what we create in the world, and they're in this dynamic relationship. So I look at those different levels: the structure, the flows, the relational dynamics, the goals, and the paradigms. And how do we look at those characteristics to understand what's happening? And that relates very much to leverage points, it relates to icebergs. And these are sort of some of the elements the kind of questions and elements might you look at when you're trying to understand what's happening in a system.
Great, thank you, Anna. And I think that's a perfect segue into really this question about sort of if we have a perspective of how we would go about making sense of or understanding a system, then we can get into a conversation about, okay, now how do we think about intervening? So I'm curious, because each of you sort of like brings such a unique perspective about how you think about leverage points and where you might intervene in a perspective. I'd be really curious to hear how each of you thinks about like leverage points and where you would intervene. And maybe, yeah, so Anna, if we want to start with you.
Well, I'm only going to jump in, not to speak again, but to say that the relationship to what I just said and what I think is very similar. So the where to intervene and the how to intervene actually have to be symbiotic. And it's not like this idea of going, okay, so we've analyzed it over here, now we need to create an innovation. So when we're talking about relational power dynamics, we need to then think about how we intervene and the intervention we take, about saying what are new models of power, what are new models of organizing or governance structures or economic structures, or how do we, when we're talking about the goal, how do we intervene by saying, you know, this is why the word collaboration, and I do get a bit tired with it sometimes because it's sort of a misnomer for loads of things, but it's sort of like, how do we start organizing together? We can have questions about what goals are we setting, what is our shared intention, how are we galvanizing a movement of people towards it, and how are we, I think then the question comes, and I think Danielle might talk about this as well, about leadership. It's like, how do we challenge our own assumptions and our own paradigms and notice these? So the mode of the intervener and the assumptions we have also affect the change that we create. So there's this relationship between where to intervene and how to intervene that I'm trying to make here, that they're not disconnected. They don't become this, oh, we do something different now, we now need to create a totally different toolbox. They're deeply connected in a systemic perspective.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, and at least one way I make sense of that is to appreciate that the way we see the way that we see a system is going to influence the way we choose to act in a system. So it's impossible to separate those two. So thank you, Orit. I'm curious to hear from you, perhaps about social acupuncture, but however you'd like to share. How do you think about leverage points?
Sure, perhaps just to pick up on what Anna said, because I think that this whole relational element is so important. We tend to think of power and vested interest and many similar things as things that are actually nested within specific players, like someone is really powerful or someone has a specific interest around something. But actually, power and interest are an outcome of a set of systemic relations. So they're really a characteristic of the system rather than of specific players, which actually means that they are much more flexible than we think. So once you understand that and you have an understanding again of the network and the flows, and as I said, I tend to focus on resources, information, and behavior, then the question is, where can you intervene in a way that you feel could set off an effect that will start to undermine some of these patterns? Again, by either strengthening certain ones or undermining other ones. So it could be about connecting places that haven't been connected before. It could be about adding resources or taking away resources from certain places. It could be about showing new behaviors, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the main element when you start to identify them and think about them as impact, it's really about this idea of flows and how you intervene in ways that really manipulate those flows in small elements in a way that you think is upstream enough that it will have a bigger knock-on effect. Because obviously, if you're in the middle of a huge gushing river, it won't really help. You need to position yourself in a different space. So I think that this is really important to think about. And the last point I would make on that is that when you design those interventions, it's all about anticipation and anticipatory modeling of what could be the reactions. Because we need to always remember that systems work in a certain way because they actually work for a lot of people and within a joint context, which means that any change that you would want to try to push the system towards will also create a lot of opposition. And anticipating this opposition, not because someone doesn't want you to change the system, but the shifts that you're creating actually have knock-on effects on them that they think are putting them at risk. So thinking about opposition, thinking also about competition, because just like you're trying to change the system in one way, other people are trying to change it in a completely other one. So being very aware of these dynamics and what different people are doing in different positions and places across this network is really important. I'll leave it here.
Thank you. Daniela.
I like what Anna said about, I struggle with collaboration as a term in this too, because I feel like we are trying to, we are often stuck in this funding model. I saw someone asked about funding on the comments, and this like incentive model and the celebration model that is really based on like, how are you going to win? Why should I pick you for my funding rather than them? Like, what's your metrics of success? How are you going to change the system, right? And we could go all the way to the other side and look at like, you know, collective impact models and real long-term collaborations, right? And it's kind of like Monopoly. You don't like, we can't necessarily always go all the way there. And there's nothing, if you can do collective impact models, and if you want to commit to something for 30 years, and if your funders will go along with you, amazing. But it's not going to change from here to there overnight, right? And I think the thing in the middle is, rather than collaboration, it's contribution. So I've started using that term instead, because you can contribute on your own. You can't collaborate on your own, right? Because people always say, well, how do I get the other people in my system to join us? What if they don't want to do this? And well, how do I get other collaborators? And it becomes like a barrier for people to think that they can't take action unless they're like joined up in some superhero team, right? We can contribute. We can just move from there slightly over by saying, how can we contribute? And, you know, until the funding and incentivizing systems change, and some of them are trying to change, but we're still a long way off with a lot of that. Until those change, I think a lot of actors are trying to play in two worlds. They're trying to appease over here, but also look at how they might contribute beyond their own impact credit, right? Like there's ways that you're going to take action where you don't get to take credit for the outcome because you're just doing a contribution, right? And I think that that when we look at how, I think that the question I always ask is, how is your work going to increase the impact of other nodes in the system, right? Not how are you going to change the system? How is your work going to increase the impact of other nodes in the system, which therefore means you need to know what other nodes are in the system. And, you know, you have to do some sort of sense of system understanding in order to even begin to answer that question.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it reminds me of my understanding of the impact gap canvas, and really inviting individuals to consider how are they uniquely positioned to contribute to a system, given just who they are and what they're connected to. And it really touches on the theme that we've been discussing around the importance of focusing on relationships and flows across systems, which are all living. Thank you. Alex, curious how you think about intervention points in systems.
Well, it's really interesting actually, because I think in two sort of entirely different ways in different systems, but I think some of the things that you've all been saying maybe provide bridges from some of the biology in a way to the social, which is really interesting. So I mean, if I'm doing a sort of participatory systems modeling piece of work with people, stakeholders, and policymakers, then what we'll do is we'll look at the structure of the system as expressed simply by the structure of the connections, but also look at what's important, you know, which of the things in the system are important to different stakeholders, to who, where do different sorts of actors have influence on the system. And we'll actually sort of analyze that structure to say, where do we have structurally influential nodes, if you like, either because they're on a lot of paths through the system or they have a high downstream impact. but not just that are sort of mathematically influential, but that are meaningfully influential. So, it doesn't matter if you influence a lot of things if no one cares about them as a factor. It matters that you have meaningful influence. And then, something of that sort could be a leverage point for you as a type of actor if it's you who has influence over that, or if it's someone you can form a collaboration with who has influence over that. So we're looking at this sort of subjective network analysis, as we would call it, and it's a sort of how you interpret any kind of factor or set of relationships within that system is subjective based on what matters to who's got influence over what's vulnerable to what. So it's a kind of subjective approach to sort of like network analysis and causal flow analysis that we'd use in those models. But we wouldn't say, here's your mathematical answer, to where you're going to intervene. Or these are starting points for conversations. It's about giving people, helping them extend their thinking and their insights and their intuition, giving them another way into their system. It's a starting point really for a sort of more design work. But it's kind of identifying these things that matter in the system, and that are vulnerabilities or opportunities. But that's quite static. We've spoken about these quite static representations of systems. I mean, you can do things like identify where there are feedback loops in the system from a structure, so you can think, well, I want to build up a virtuous cycle or kind of suppress a vicious cycle. So you can think about these kinds of things structurally, the dynamics that way. In the biological systems where I work and where I sort of started doing this, or in permaculture, you're really thinking about evolving or developing ecosystems. So I started off sort of transforming these permaculture ideas to bacteria living in collectives. And the real momentum in this system is their power to evolve, to rapidly adapt to change. So if you've got, so I was looking at bacteria that cause problems in the cystic fibrosis lung, and essentially they live together cooperatively. So that almost like your point of intervention is, well, your momentum is their ability to evolve, and a potential point of intervention for you is something that these bacteria depend on, which is that they cooperate together. So I developed sort of suggested mode of intervention to engineer a tragedy of the commons for these bacteria. So that is changing the context, changing their evolutionary context, such that what was favorable for them is changed, so that no longer are they able to stably cooperate. And I think this idea of changing, if you like, the selective conditions, changing the context, changing the environments to foster certain types of evolution and self-organization, I think that's something that I have not, I think, but I mean, I'm not some sort of naive natural scientist. I've been working in policy for 10 years, but how do we bridge this kind of manipulating the dynamics? I think a lot of you have spoken to things that are about manipulating the dynamics and the context which foster the system, because it's the system's momentum we want to use. So it's really that's to me is the crux of can we get to that point? But I think also there's a very interesting sort of aspect to biology which I hadn't really thought of before just sort of reading Anna's paper, the paradigm, the framing paradigm. So in biology and in evolution, when we think about when individual organisms evolved to form new levels of individuality, new levels of cooperation, moving say from single cells to multicellular organisms, there's a sense in which you can think of that as these systems constructing themselves new selective processes and contexts for themselves, so that they are building the conditions which will make this cooperative higher level entity stable, right? There's a kind of higher level autopoiesis going on in these systems. It's not just the self-making of the individual, but it's a self-making of the individual processes and contexts which make a new sort of thing stable. So I'd just be really interested to hear what you others, whether that sort of biological stuff, whether you do feel it connects to the kind of higher order things that you're looking at, the dynamics, the framing paradigms.
I think my point, Alex, is that people are biology, right? So that I'm really, the systems view is saying that people are part of biology, and part of the problem, part of the reason why we do systems change is because we have gone out of sync. Like humans have kind of thought that they are not part of nature and they're not part of biology and they're not part of that. So a lot of my work has been about integrating that living systems perspective with what that means as a social being. Like that's why the role of consciousness is an evolved evolution of us being human. It's just a part of our biology. It's who we are. And I totally like your framing. And I grappled with the word manipulation for years, actually. And one of my colleagues, kind of tutors as well, she used to say, manipulation isn't a bad thing. It's like, it's working. But I also like the word cultivating and fostering and nurturing, those organic terms, which I think for me, I feel very similar to the idea of manipulation, which is working with the grain of our biology and our nature and our evolution and how we self-organize. And what does that mean when we translate into social language? So it's the social language. We're still biological beings, but we're translating into social language to say, how do we work with those processes to say, well, how do we self-organize? What does that mean when we talk about governance? Like, how do we self-organize from a governance perspective? What does it mean when we talk about it economically? But they're still, for me personally, they're still the work that we do, it's still based in some of those living systems principles, not as a kind of living systems over here and socials over here, and we need to transport them in, but from an understanding of we are part of, we are living beings ourselves. So I guess, I don't know if that's answering your question, but it's riffing off what you were saying there around how we understand that and how we get into alignment with ourselves as living beings is both part of the problem, but also could be part of that solution. So I quite like using these organic biological terms. Why I talk about cultivating systems change, because it's got something that has that quality to it that I think is also that's a paradigm as well. When we talk about impact, I did a tweet yesterday which like, impact reminds me about punching somebody in the face. It's got this kind of feeling to it, rather than like cultivating or Aikido or acupuncture. I like these words because they have this sense of dynamism and working with, rather than like we're going to get the system, we're going to manipulate it, we're going to do it, so that matters because that's a paradigm that we put on.
Yeah. Go ahead, Alex.
No, I was just going to say thank you. I mean, I really like that. I mean, I think I'm very fully on board with the thinking of I do think of these systems as living systems. I'm very on board with that, and it's. But I suppose, in a way, my question is, I don't know, maybe it comes from a sort of hesitancy of doing it. But, in a biological system, we have a lot of sort of well understood, or, in a microbiological system, say, well understood ideas about how we can, what drives evolution in different directions. We've got much more access, I think, to how can we foster these kind of dynamics? How can we relate to the systems? How can we manipulate these contexts? So, I guess I'd love to hear about, I don't know, are there practical tools, or is it just about kind of developing the real knowledge of the system, of what can foster change, of how we can cultivate and interact with these systems? Or are there things we can say, we could experimentally try to manipulate this context, and we think that it will change things? I mean, I think David Sloan Wilson has tried to do this sort of application of the theory of sort of the evolution of cooperation to working with social groups. This idea that if you share the benefits, say, of something you do within a group, you foster cooperation within that group if they're shared evenly. Like, people have directly tried to apply these kind of evolutionary theories, which seems very naive. I mean, not that we're not biological, but things are much more complex in the social world. So it'd just be really great to hear, I guess, how do we learn to manipulate, work with, steer social context, social self-organization.
Yeah, please, Ari.
Sorry, can I just?
Sorry.
No, just to jump in there, because I love the whole idea of working through ecological frameworks and thinking about evolution and thinking about niches. And I work a lot with, fitness landscapes and those kind of elements. And I think that for me, I completely agree with you, Alex, it is more complex, right? Than when we look within biology. I think from my very lack of knowledge in biology. But I think that it's really about understanding it from multiple dimensions. So if you think about the social ecology as an evolving system and an evolving set of traits and conditions that relates to economics, politics, culture, and technology. And if you're able to identify different shifts that are happening within those different dimensions, then you could get a better understanding of where certain evolutionary processes from a social perspective would lead. And therefore you could better identify where you might have a higher probability of fit with certain ideas and with certain directions and with certain models, and where you won't have it. I think, for example, there have been really interesting models that came after the financial crisis of playing with new different financial organization and banking tools. But at the end of the day, the ones that have succeeded actually evolved to look like traditional banks. So thinking about the financial system as a kind of, as an ocean, and thinking about what it actually means to swim in water. And at the end of the day, you need to develop and evolve certain similar traits, understanding those traits within that environment that constrain, and put that together with other elements that fit into it, political and technological and cultural, you can have a better scope of where evolution could lead from a social organization perspective. So there's a lot to play with there.
Yeah, and I think just there's so much depth in this topic, and I'm really present to that, and just so appreciate everything that each of you have shared, and recognizing the time we have left. I'm tempted to at least attempt to move us into territory which may be a little bit challenging to nail down given what it is that we're talking about, but it's really this question of concreteness and action. So I still vividly remember reading Thinking in Systems and Donella Meadows when I first encountered leverage points, and immediately thought, this is amazing. I want to apply it. What do I do? And now, however many years later, it's been over a decade. I think I have a better sense, but I definitely don't have very many answers. So I'm curious. And it's a little bit of an artificial question, but I'd be curious to hear sort of any concrete examples that each of you might share about how you sort of took the concept of a leverage point and translated it specifically into action. So if we sort of move out of more conceptual territory, for anybody listening who sort of has this question about how do I translate these concepts into concrete action, I'm curious if each of you might share something, recognizing that it's hard.
I have a story that I usually tell. So people who might have heard me before has a little story. And it goes back to this idea of reframing the paradigm and the goal of the system as a leverage point. And what does that actually mean? And we were working on a diagnostic of single-use plastic water bottles. And how do we get rid of single-use water bottles in London? And a system diagnostic of that. And it's quite a functional structural issue, to be honest with you. But we were doing it from a marine perspective. So we're doing it from a deeper value and a deeper paradigmal level of saying, how do we value the ocean? And actually we wanted to raise the consciousness of people about the ocean. It wasn't about just structural things, but we wanted to do it at all those levels. And one of the moments in our systems diagnostic was when we reframed the goal of the system, or when we looked at and really understood, and it sounds simple when I say it now, but when we were doing it, it was quite a big aha moment. And it's not where did we intervene, but it changed where we intervened. So what we did was saying, how do we rid single-use plastic water bottles? What do we do here? How do we understand how that might change? And when we said, well, what's the purpose of the system? What's the goal of the system? The goal of the system is hydrating Londoners, right? We need water. So we need to hydrate. We need food. We need to drink out of water bottles. And then we said, okay, well, how do we deliver that? What's the structure we need to deliver that? And how do we understand that our relationship to water and the ocean and who we are is really important and has a connection to our mental models? And it changed the interventions that we took as a group of people. So it's not like there is a perfect intervention point. It chose the choices we made as a project team on where we interviewed. What contribution did we want to make? We decided we didn't want to work with recycling. We didn't want to work with the circular economy. We didn't want to work with, because that was all still caught up with the idea of plastic. What we wanted to do was say, how do we actually change the way we hydrate ourselves? And it shifted the whole frame of our interventions. Then we chose leverage points in that language that were much more about putting in fountains, about helping with, water bottles and actually supporting that, and not spending our energy and resource, which is what leverage points was about, on recycling or circular economy. Important as it is, and we need to do work there, but it helps us make the choice. And so that analysis, and that's just one thing, and we did a lot of other things, also did that. And we have another example of when we try to look at meat, and we're saying meat is a massive problem, and we did our systems analysis, and we reframed the goal of the system, and we said it's actually about achieving our protein needs. And so for me, it's actually a very simple tool, but it's very hard. Now I run a lot of workshops where we say, what is the purpose and how do you reframe the system to help you understand why you intervene and what you're trying to do here? And you're not perpetuating models of economic growth necessarily on some things. You're not perpetuating old structures. So that for me is a very simple practical tool. And that's the kind of example I like to use, because it speaks to those higher leverage points. It speaks to those higher potential of the system, from what mindset you're coming from to change what you're doing.
That's a wonderful example. Thank you, Anna.
I'll just jump in with one element that hopefully you'll find helpful. I think it's also about timing. So much about, leverage point is about finding the right time. And for the last few years, I've been obsessed with cities. That's the issue I'm mostly focusing on. And if you think about what has been happening in cities just over the past year and following the pandemic, we're seeing so many shifts in cities, right? And so many shifts that, people have been talking about, and different players in the system have been putting together policies and initiatives and ideas for bicycle lanes, for, the whole 15-minute city, for changing so many of urban dynamics. It's not that they thought about it now. It is about taking advantage of opportunities that are emerging now, because you have decision makers who need solutions to something else, and actually funneling those solutions now and putting them in front of the right people at the right time. And I think this is another very important element that relates to what an actual leverage point is. A leverage point is a temporal point as well within that system. Thanks.
Thank you, Ari.
So I think it's quite difficult for me to give policy examples, because we're being recorded and this is going to be so. But I think it's really interesting, connecting just to what Ori just said also about the temporal stuff. So we've had a lot of success in our policy work, being identify sort of structurally important points within big systems which have big policy programs applied to them. To identify vulnerabilities where key factors which influence a lot of outcomes that matter to the departments we work with are actually all controlled by other government departments. And they've redesigned their delivery actually of policy. They've done a lot of redesign to kind of mitigate against this kind of vulnerability, if you like, which is the opposite, say, of a leverage point. And we've also been able to identify kind of crucial points in the system where stakeholder behavior is absolutely vital to the outcomes, again, that matter in this program, and stakeholders are the ones, in fact, doing the work in this situation. And we were then able to kind of use that identification of that point, you know, that crux within the system for what mattered to DEFRA. You can probably guess who the stakeholders are. But and looking then upstream at the constraints and all the structural and social, cultural and economic constraints that were facing farmers. I mean, I think I'm allowed to say that we were working with that. So they were then really able to also, again, like take account of that within the program design and delivery, and looking at joined up delivery. But that's not then changing the whole system. But I was just actually really struck thinking then when you mentioned, Arit, about the time dependency, that actually the window for us was Brexit and all of that policy changing simultaneously, and the recognition that there's a huge number of interconnected things happening. And to actually bringing in those systems approaches, I think probably the bigger change has been that they've really taken that on, and they now, because we ran this process in such a way that we built in capacity building, that we did it in a, you know, real kind of intensive co-production, that now this has been taken on and it's used by them. They develop their own analysis tools, you know, and ways of using the systems approach, and they are taking on, it has a life of its own in that sense. They are developing their own policy analysis and policy thinking based around that approach. So maybe that, I mean, that was actually probably the bigger thing, that window of opportunity, and being able to sort of set in process a systems thinking and embed systems thinking in that department, in parts of that department. That was kind of the lever in a sense. And we just happened on that, or, you know, that was a chance for them to do something different. So, you know, that's kind of quite interesting in regards to that. That wasn't my great plan. Yeah, I didn't engineer that situation.
And yet it still worked. Thank you, Alex. So before we head into questions, I'm curious, Daniela, if you have thoughts or an example of concept to action.
Sure. And I'm sorry, I can't actually stay much longer for Q&A, but I'll give you, what I'm noticing is that we use these terms like practical. What's practical, right? And it's based on our cultural norms around something being speedy in our human mind time, rather when we're looking at biology is not being constrained by this human mind sense of time, right? And we also are sometimes, you know, okay, we're now replacing the water bottles, but we're you know, replacing meat, but we're selling this like fake meat, but we're still selling it, right? So we still are in this corporate structure, or we're like trying to change a policy and we're still in if it's patriarchal, but it doesn't matter, women or men at the top, doesn't matter. It's this sense of like, there's someone who knows better and we're going to create this government structure. And I think there's different times to take on different levels of this, right? So I'm thinking of this guy, Ma Jun, who's a really famous environmental activist journalist in China. And he was a journalist, read all these, you know, realized there was all this environmental degradation, wrote a lot of books, and recognized that there is government data on environmental violations, but it's in Chinese in the back of a government website. No one can find it. And so his intervention, based on his deeper understanding of the system, was, wow, how do we make that available in English and other languages, really accessible, and then write to Nike, Apple, and whoever and say, I know that you care about the, you know, not working in a sweatshop and that the impact of that, but did you know that the company that you're working for, that's making your products has 27 environmental violations? Here, it's all available online. What would happen if everyone knew that, right? So but through that to me, it's like you're working within the system, but you're working on a human short-term timeline, and you're like, how can I do something that is going to accelerate change in my lifetime, right? But then there's other pieces that would be like, you know, how do we change how this whole idea of consumerism? These are just really different levels and different depths. And when I talk to students about this too, it's like some of them are these huge picture thinkers, right? And they're like, down with the patriarchy, you know, down with capitalism. And I want to them, it's like, how do we make it practical for your lifetime right now that you're contributing to that? So you're moving the system so that the next person can help move it in that direction. Does that make sense? And then you have people that are only thinking of the next little thing. I want to sell, something that's wrapped in a different kind of plastic that's more compostable. Fine. And how do you get those people to think about, but what's deeper in this system? And so there's not a right answer. It's about your own sense of timeline and how you want to contribute. So, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And I think maybe as an attempt to close at least this part of the conversation, I'm really brought back actually something, Orit, to what I read in social acupuncture about this distinction between sort of Western versus Eastern approaches to management, and how Western approaches are often fixated on define the end state and make a plan to get there. Whereas Eastern approaches, if I'm channeling them correctly, is how do we set sense of direction? How do we understand where the system is and then attempt to steer it in that direction? So with that, truly for each of you, I really want to express my gratitude, our gratitude, both for this conversation, but for all of the work that you're doing to contribute to steering some of these really complex systems in a better direction. So with that, if any of you do need to leave us, I know we're a little bit over time. Thank you for joining. Something we will do is share some of the resources that each of our speakers have put together. I know I got a lot of value reading through them, so we'll share that in the SI community and on YouTube. And with that, I'd love to bring in a few questions for those of you who can stay. So maybe starting with Luanita, who says, I'm very interested in the concepts of impact gaps, Daniela, and unsustainable tensions, Orit. Can you perhaps give a practical example of these?
I'll jump in for 30 seconds and then I'm going to have to run. I was just sending the note.
Thank you.
But I think that is an example that Majun in China is an example of an impact gap, like tiny little thing, right? And sometimes, at that really kind of surface level, one of the Skoll awardees, so they award $1 million a year to different social enterprises. They're usually nonprofits, and one of the for-profit awardees was an organization called Angaza, and they make solar as a service. They said how they started out. They were going to do solar as a service, which means I'm going to go to an off-grid community, install solar, and then every week, every month, you're going to pay me to keep that solar running, right? And when they started it, they had to put 100,000 pounds more, whatever the number was, into creating their proprietary app, right? They had to make this app just like everyone else. And they realized at that point, we could continue to just be another solar as a service company. Not that there's anything wrong with that, it's great. But there's a gap here that, like, why is everyone having to spend 100,000 pounds each, every one of these hundreds of companies, to make their own proprietary app? And so they stopped deciding to be a solar company and they started to white label that app. And now their app is used at solar companies all over the world. And it's also used by people selling other off-grid products like in-home gasifying cook stoves or, solar pumps or whatever those things are. And now they all have a faster access to market. They don't have to spend that initial 100,000 pounds or whatever it is. And to me, that's like that's just like one, you're not changing the system necessarily, but you are designing your impact by saying, how can I increase the impact of other nodes in the system? So with that, I'm going to run and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Daniela. And Orit, do you have any practical examples you might be able to share about unsustainable tensions?
Wow, in 30 seconds, it's a hard one. But
sorry.
I think it's really about identifying contradicting dynamics within a certain setting. Think about cities and gentrification. So you have an area that is kind of cheap, and then cool people move in and they open really cool cafes, and it becomes really trendy. And it's a great place to hang out. So people want to hang out there, and then it becomes much more expensive to hang out there because obviously the cost of those properties rise. And there is an unsustainable tension there building up within that space, within the desirability of the space, and what enables it to remain diverse and hip and nice. And this is why you go there. So over time, you see this trend with all of these areas actually becoming cool, becoming super expensive. So they become completely uncool and they become dead. Just some really expensive ones. So you have these dynamics, and you can anticipate how that is going to go off, because when certain dynamics are set off in the system, unless there are counter forces, they will overshoot. So it's really about identifying where they're going to overshoot, putting that together with, different trends, and seeing where an unsustainable collapse will inevitably happen. You will not know exactly when, but you will know that it will occur. And then the idea is to think about how to monitor it. So to see the early signs of the slowdown and the collapse, and then think about it again from leverage perspective. What can you use it for?
That's great. Thank you, Orit. So maybe just a quick check, Orit, Alex, if we do have some more, and Anna, we do have some more questions. Mindful, we're 10 minutes past. Quick show of hands if you want another question. Okay. It's a meaty one, but here we go. Rajiv asks, how do we intervene at a paradigmatic level, when this can often mean we are challenging prevailing narratives, philosophies, ideologies that people follow?
I don't mind jumping in with that one. I don't say I have the answer. I have my answer, which is the way that I address this question, which is two things. One is, how do you notice your own paradigm? So you're just questioning it. So a lot of it's to do with questioning, to be honest with you. So how do you first understand what paradigm you're coming from, and really notice that tension between, I'm in the current paradigm, so I'm playing in that paradigm all the time, and I'm trying to understand what a new paradigm might feel like and look like. So how can I work with that tension in me and bring that into the interventions that I work with? The second thing, then, when we say that we're running a project, we actually talk about inquiry projects. So they're not necessarily saying we're in a new paradigm, we're working with that paradigm, because there is no new paradigm. They're always at the edges. So then we talk about liminal spaces and in living systems, we talked about that earlier. So then, therefore, to work into a paradigm, you're working into it, you're asking questions, you're exploring. So I guess when we talk about working with paradigms or working on paradigmal, I don't know, interventions, if that's a thing, sorry, we talk about working with inquiry, working with asking the questions and trying to find out what the experiments are and how we're exploring into that, rather than knowing, oh, we're going to work from this paradigm now. And it's like, well, this goes back to Orit's point about tensions. It's like, well, you can't just work from that paradigm. You're working with the tension of the current system and what you want to be working into, but noticing that and looking at what's happening. So I guess I'm just advocating, and we need to look at this more, of how do people value that inquiry-based approach of really pushing into those edges and testing them and working with them. And I guess that's the way that I've tried to work with it. And I think the second thing is to work with narratives. So therefore, narratives and communications and framing is also an interesting intervention space, where you're actually saying, how do you reframe the dialogue and offer new ways and see that's also, you should do it quite in an inquiring way. You should say, okay, what framing can help us reframe who we are, how we identify, how we belong, and that can help move us into new spaces to set a context to then do the structural work underneath that.
Yeah, I really love that. And I love your description of, there's not sort of these paradigms that we're shifting into and out of, despite the fact we talk about paradigm shifts. Your description of sort of working on the edges, for me, reminds me of the concept of adjacent possible, of sort of like what's just beyond the horizon that we can step into, and we're just sort of continually stepping into or crystallizing new ways of thinking, which comes through lots of inquiry. Thank you. Orit or Alex, anything else you'd like to share about working at the paradigmatic level?
I mean, it's the sort of million dollar question, isn't it? I mean, I think there are things that you can do when people know that things aren't working, you know, when people are struggling, when, you know, that they know that they're constrained by what's happening to you. You know, you can use methods, systems methods, to help people do second and third order learning, if you like, to really make explicit their assumptions and their constraints. But I think, well, then what's key is almost have sort of, you know, have provocateurs in the room as well, you know, have people who'll be, you know, who can say, well, here's this other perspective actually. So, you know, there's a real art to that, you know, but it's making these things visible first, and then, you know, bringing things in. And I think, as Anna said, the sort of narratives and suddenly seeing the sort of visual, you know, I found it quite useful actually in just these mapping exercises. When you see a sort of feedback that has a number of your constraints and assumptions in it, that's trapping you in the thing that you explicitly say you don't want, then that's can be quite a powerful moment. And if there's someone from a completely different perspective there, you know, who can say, have you thought about this? Then that's really helpful. But that's not something that's very easy to sort of engineer or set up, right? It's something that you would have to, you know, do as you were going through a process of inquiry, I think, as Anna said. But yeah, the big question.
maybe I guess Donella Meadows wrote about leverage points in 97. Maybe 24 years from now we'll have better answers. Maybe not.
Better questions, Mark. Better questions.
True. Thank you, Anna. And with that, I just really want to thank all of you, all three of you, again, so much for sharing and for being with us today, and for all of you watching. Hopefully you found it as insightful as I did, and we hope to see you on a future event with Systems Innovation. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Yes, bye.
Thank you.